Well, hello. This is a video about DOM events. And what are DOM events? Well, events are the way that we can make our programs respond to what's happening, right? The most obvious version of this is that we might want to respond to something like the user clicking their mouse, right? So we need some way for our program to be notified about when the user clicks their mouse, and then we can run JavaScript in response to that and do things with the DOM, for example, that are our response. Maybe we change some CSS, or we add a new element onto the page, or we change the text of an element. We can do anything we want, but in order to be able to do something, we need to be able to sort of know what's going on. So what is an event? It's just a way of describing some specific thing happening in the world of our program, in the world of the web page in this particular case. So a click from the user is an event, a timer expiring is an event, a sound playing or finishing playing could be an event. The user's internet connection dropping out could be an event that we could respond to. There's all kinds, right? And we'll look at the documentation and see just how many there are. The exciting thing is that these are the ways that our program can be responsive. Now, the DOM has a bunch of events built into it, and these are events associated with the kinds of things that the user can do on the web page, but also the sorts of things that can just happen on a web page regardless of user input specifically. So this is what's going to allow us to write exciting programs that are more than just something that runs at the start of a web page. Now, this is actually part of a much larger philosophy of programming called event-driven programming. So if you're used to something like P5, for example, we're used to this idea that we've got a draw loop, which is a function that runs once per frame, and we kind of do a lot of our stuff inside that draw loop, knowing that it's going to happen once per animation frame. And so that's a specific way of thinking about how our program works, right? Well, in event-driven programming, we don't, generally speaking, have that idea of animation, although we can. Instead, we think of our program as a set of functions that respond to different kinds of events that can occur. Clicks or key presses on the keyboard, or GPS updates, or all kinds of things that you might imagine that your program could be responding to. That's how we do event-driven programming. And so the way that that works, as I've kind of intimated, is that we need to know what kinds of events can occur, and then we need to be able to provide a function that should respond to a specific kind of an event. So a click is a kind of an event that can occur, so that's an event type, and then the function that we write that would respond to a click is called an event handler. Okay? That's the basic world that we're going to exist in when we do event-driven programming. So again, as with most of these things, let's work on an example of some of this event-driven programming so we can see what it means to make our programs interactive in this particular way. So to begin with, we're going to need, as always, a web page, right? So let us begin with a web page. So let's start a little project. So I'm going to head over to my repository, into my topics folder, web page folder, and I'm going to make a new folder called DOM events, which is the name of this topic, and I'm going to open it in Atom. Comme ça. And again, I'm going to need some building blocks, so I'm going to add an HTML page. So index.html is my new file, and I'm going to paste in the page that I had earlier on. So I'm going to save that there. It doesn't seem to want to look like an HTML page. There we go. So this is, again, a fairly straightforward little page with a few bits and pieces in it. It's got a title, it's got a heading, etc. If I run this page in my browser, as always, then what am I going to see? I'm going to switch over to the browser and drag it down here. And you can see it's like pretty boring. Lorem ipsum text with an H1, an H2, and a p tag. There's a couple more things that are implied by this HTML that we need to add. One of those things is going to be our script. So we need a JavaScript folder. So I'm going to make that JS. And in there, I'm going to make my new script file, js/script.js. So this is where I'm going to write my program, my exciting event-driven program. The other thing this HTML implies should exist, you are hopefully noticing, is a style sheet. So I'll make that. Again, I'm not really working with a style sheet in any serious way here, but I may as well make a CSS folder and in it make a style.css file. And again, if I want to, maybe I'll just do the usual of going sans serif because I prefer web pages and sans serif. Yeah, looks ever so slightly more something, less like a manuscript. So let's not worry about that. So we've got all of the bits and pieces that this HTML file needs. It's not the most exciting file because I don't want to highlight doing complicated things with HTML. I want to highlight this idea of event-driven programming and the DOM. So clearly we're going to write stuff here in our main script, right? Let us begin. So there are a bunch of different kinds of events that exist in the DOM. And before I get to the kind of user interaction stuff, I just want to review the key time-based events that we can work with inside the DOM. And you may well already be familiar with these things. So let's grab a piece of the document to work with. So I'm going to get this paragraph here. So I'm going to use its ID. So I'm going to use getElementById paragraph to get the paragraph element. So I'm going to call it paragraph, and I'm going to say document.getElementById paragraph. This is very standard, right, for DOM-based programming. Is at some point I'm going to need an element to actually work with if I want to have some kind of visible result. That's the canvas, in a sense, that we're working with here. So with that, what if I wanted this paragraph to change color after a delay? Well, the DOM, the browser has a built-in, this is not the DOM actually, the browser has a built-in function called setTimeout. You've probably run into it before. And what setTimeout lets us do is run a function after a delay. So the first argument that it wants is the function. So we'll put a function in here. You can give it a named function or an anonymous function. If the number of instructions that you're going to run is small, I would suggest using an anonymous function, which is what I'm going to do here. So here's my anonymous function, and then the other thing that we would give it after that is the amount of time to delay before calling that function, right? So if I want to delay for 3 seconds, then I write 3000 because it's in milliseconds. So it's going to run this function in 3000 milliseconds. Those are the two arguments. So in here, what do I want to do? Well, whatever, really. I mean, it's anything that I want to do to manipulate the DOM. I could change the text of the paragraph. I could add a child to the paragraph with append child. In this instance, I'm going to make it turn red. So I'm going to say paragraph.style, and I'm going to access its color property, and I'm going to set it to red because that will be easy for us to see. Okay? So setTimeout is going to run this function here, which we can see sets the color property of our paragraph to red, and it's going to do it after 3 seconds. So if I save this and head back and I wait for 3 seconds, it turned red. So this is already more exciting than what we had seen before with standard DOM, with the DOM overview, because there the paragraph just would have been red from the beginning. Here, the page has a kind of liveliness to it, right? It's one way and then it's another way. So something happened. And that's the whole point of event-driven programming, right? Things happen in our program. And that is what makes it exciting to interact with. So that's one of the time-based functions is setTimeout. You give it the function to call and how long to wait before calling it. setTimeout has a relative called setInterval, which does exactly the same thing, except that it calls the function over and over again. So let's write an interval. So in this instance, what I want to do is recreate the blink tag, which used to be an element in HTML that would allow you to make text blink, and then somebody decided that it was too obnoxious, and so now you're not allowed to use it anymore. But we can recreate it with JavaScript because we're programmers. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to assume that there's a function called blink, because this is complicated enough that I don't want to use an anonymous function. And I'm going to cause whatever it is that I'm going to be blinking to blink every 500 milliseconds. So reasonably quickly. So what does my blink function need to do? Well, we know that the blink function here is going to be called over and over again. So what should it do? What it should do is I'm going to make the element blink in and out, and I'm going to do that by setting its, what am I going to do? I'm just going to set its opacity backwards and forwards from 0. that seems easy. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get its opacity. So I'm going to say its opacity is paragraph.style opacity. That will give me its opacity. Now, CSS properties come out as a string, technically. That can be important to remember. But in this instance, because I just want to oscillate between 1 and 0, it's not such a big deal. So I can say if the opacity is, what am I going to do here? If it equals 1, I guess because it's a string, if it's 1, then I want to set it to 0. So I'm going to say paragraph.style opacity is assigned 0. And if it's not 1, then I guess it's 0. So then I'll do the opposite kind of thing. I'll set paragraph.style opacity is assigned 1. So that way we're switching between the two things, right? We're saying get its opacity. If it's 1, make it 0, and otherwise make it 1. And it's going to therefore flip backwards and forwards between 0 and 1 every 500 milliseconds because the function is going to get repeatedly called by set interval. Let's go take a look at that. And there you go, a blink tag. Obnoxious. You can see why people didn't really want just everybody very easily making things blink on their web page. Pretty obnoxious, and yet like now I feel like it's an underused effect. It's pretty funny. People used to use blink tags with the under construction message on their website and stuff. I kind of like it. I think it's like, it's so obnoxious, it's quite fun. So we can make our own blink tag this way. So that's a nice little function that is switching the opacity backwards and forwards between 0 and 1, made ever so slightly more annoying by the fact that the opacity is a string. But that's okay, we made it work. And the key thing here is set interval is just going to call this function over and over again every 500 milliseconds. Lovely. There is one more time function which you may not have run into. You may not have run into those ones either, that's completely okay. And the one thing that you sometimes want to do on a web page, although not always, is sometimes you do actually want to access this idea of animation, that you want to do a frame by frame kind of a thing. Think about fading out, for example. If you want to fade something out, you want to do it every frame that the web page is kind of rendering its visuals. You don't want to do it every like 100 milliseconds or something because it might be a bit jittery and not feel smooth. So really what you want to do is fade out across the actual animation timeline of the browser. And so there is a function that allows us to do this. So let us do it in the simplest way that I can come up with right now. So we've got our paragraph. Let us also have a variable that's going to keep track of its opacity. I'm just going to call it opacity. And I'm going to start it at 1. So the default is that the opacity is going to be 1. And I'm also going to set the paragraphs. Do I need to do this? No, not really. I'm just going to leave it like that. So we've got the paragraph and we've got the opacity of the paragraph. Now, if I want to repeatedly reduce the opacity of this paragraph by a little bit every frame, how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to write a function to do it, and it's going to be called fade out. And what it's going to do is it's going to do one step of this process, right? So every time fade out is going to get called, it's going to reduce the opacity a little bit. So we're going to say opacity minus equals 0.01, which is a nice small amount for it to fade by. And then we're going to set the paragraph's opacity to that amount. So we can say paragraph.style to access its style, and opacity to get its opacity. And we'll set it to that value, so it will go down a bit, right? So now I could say fade out, right? I could call that function. Now that's great because it is going to fade it out, but it's only going to do this once, right? It's only going to call fade out that one time. It's going to reduce its opacity a little bit, but it's not really going to look very impressive. If we go and look at the thing here, you would be hard-pressed to tell that the opacity here has been reduced by a small amount, even if it has. So we could do this with set interval, right? We could say set interval fade out. We could call it every 500 milliseconds. Is that going to be too annoying? I don't know. You can see that's very slow. Let's make it a little faster. I'm sitting here staring at it, trying to work out if it's becoming invisible. It is becoming invisible. So it's running at a frame rate of 1 frame per 100 milliseconds, right? There's nothing terribly wrong with that. But if you are animating visual things in the browser, it is better to use a different approach, which is to use a function called request animation frame. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to start the fade out by just calling fade out. And what we can do is we can have fade out keep calling itself until the opacity reaches 0. So what we can say is if the opacity is still greater than 0, which means that we need to keep fading, right? Because there's still fading to be done, then I want to call it again, but I want to call it again when the next animation frame is ready, when the browser's ready to animate it again. So we can say request animation frame, which is this magical function that we can call, and then we tell it the function that it should run when the next animation frame is running, and the function would be fade out again. So this is a nice little structure. So this call to fade out up here sets the process going, right? So the opacity is 1, we call fade out, it reduces the opacity a bit, and then sets it on the element, and then it checks, is it still bigger than 0? Well, of course it is, because we've only taken a small amount off. And so it says on the next animation frame, call fade out again. So then fade out gets called again on the next frame, this is sort of like a draw loop now, right? This is basically like a draw. It reduces the opacity again, sets it, is it still above 0? If it is, do it again on the next animation frame. So this is going to keep looping, just like draw, until the opacity reaches 0. When it reaches 0, it's not going to ask to be run again in the next animation frame, and so the animation stops. So if we head back, away goes the thing, and the nice thing about that is that it's fading out using the browser's animation system. It's a good thing because you're kind of using the correct system inside the browser to do that kind of visual animation. So that's the third kind of twin or sister or something, nephew, I don't know, of set timeout for doing something once after a delay, set interval for doing something over and over again at an interval, and then request animation frame in order to do something at the frame rate of your browser. Okay, those are the big three. So those are the big three. What else can we do? Well, we can do a lot. And for the rest of this discussion, we're actually going to talk entirely about just one function, one method that we have access to through the document object model that lets us pay attention to a huge number of different kinds of events that it can occur, right? So we've looked at a very specific set of time-based events, like a timer expires, or an interval expires, or a frame of the frame rate of the browser, a frame is rendered. Those are events, but there are lots of other events. So for the vast majority of events that we're going to respond to when we're programming with the DOM, there's just one method that we use every single time. And it's called add event listener. So let's apply this to the entire document. So we've got document, which we know is the document, that's the entire web page. And we can say add event listener. This is this magical thing. And this is what's going to let us pay attention to specific kinds of things that are going to occur. And it takes 2 arguments that we need to care about. The first one is a string that gives you the name of the kind of event that you want to pay attention to. So in this instance, I'm going to choose a very simple one, which is click. It's called click. You have to write it this way. It matters that it's all lowercase, that it's the word click, etc. And this refers to the user clicking their mouse, right? So the first argument is the thing you want to pay attention to on the document. The second thing that you give it is a function. Function, and this function does have one parameter, which I'm going to call event. We'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so this is the function that's going to be called when the click happens. So this function is called the event handler, or sometimes the callback function. So when a click happens, this function will be called. Now what's it going to do? Well, again, this then suddenly gets off to the whole question of like, well, what do you want to do with anything at all? For the purposes of right now, let's just change the background of the entire document's body to a color. So let's just say document.body. So document.body is a specific way that you can access the body tag of your document without using getElement by ID or by tag name, etc. You can just say document.body and it will give you that part of the document. And then we can say .style, background color, and then we can set it. So let's make the background red. So this is a simple event listener. The beauty of this is that it's always the same. Whatever event, whatever we're doing, this basic formula is going to be the same. We have add event listener. The kind of event is click in this instance, but we will be able to change this. And then a function to call when the event happens. And in this case, it's going to set the background color of the document to red. So what does this do? Well, we have our page just sitting there minding its own business. But if I click anywhere on the document, 1, 2, 3, click, oh, the background color went red, which again is not surprising because we're programmers and you saw me do that. But this is now an interactive web page, right? If I reload it and I click, big surprise, you know, if somebody wasn't ready for this, it's not a normal thing for a web page to do. And they might think that they hacked into the mainframe or that the mainframe hacked into them. Who knows what somebody would react to this with. So we've got an interaction going on now, and that's very, very exciting. So this is where a lot of our power is going to come from. One of the most important things to know right away, though, is that we don't have to use document here. Currently what we're doing is we're saying document.addEventListener click, and what that's doing is it's saying listen for a click anywhere on the page, on the entire document. So wherever I click, that click event is going to be triggered, okay? But we can listen for events on specific elements. So let's do that instead. So I'm going to get my paragraph back. So let paragraph be document.getElementById paragraph. I think that's what it was called. And instead of listening for this clicking on the document, we can listen for the click in a much more specific place. And let's do the same thing to these other bits here. So we can say paragraph.addEventListener click, and now that's going to say the click was only going to be noticed by this particular event listener if the click is on the paragraph. The paragraph is the target of the click. So then this function here is going to be called if I click on the paragraph, and it's going to set the background color of that paragraph to red if I click on it, right? So what does that look like? I can click over here and down here. I'm clicking, by the way. Click on the heading, nothing's happening, because it only cares if I click here on the paragraph. So if I click here, click, the background color turns red. Again, that's what you would expect because that's what the program does, but we have an interactive web page by doing this. And in particular now, we can basically target specific elements, and like with this click event that we're using right now, we're effectively turning something into a button, right? Literally anything on the page could be a button. It could care about being clicked on. So that's already pretty exciting, I think. So what else do we have to say about this to get a handle on this question of add event listener? So what I really want to do is I want to talk about this general question of event listeners in the context of this click event. Event listeners, they all work the same way, right? If the thing happens, if the click happens, call this function. That's always the same. That's how add event listener just works with everything. So let's explore this a little further on. So one thing you may have noticed that I kind of slipped in there, maybe you muttered to yourself about it, maybe you didn't, is I gave this function a parameter that I called event. It doesn't have to be called event. Some people call it E to be a little bit more brief. I think calling it event is a very sensible idea because what this parameter will contain when the function gets called is information about the event, okay? So we could actually even take a look at what's inside there. We could say console.log inside our function event. So just print out whatever is inside this event when I click on the paragraph. So it's going to contain a bunch of information that will tell us about the event that occurred. Let's go have a look. So I'm going to open up my console over here, and I'm going to click on this paragraph, which will trigger the function, which will trigger that console.log. So click, there we go. So it says mouse event here, and if I unfold it, you can see there's a lot of information here about what just happened. It tells me that I was not holding the Alt key down. There's something called bubbles. Obviously, we're not going to have to worry about everything here. Let's have a look at some other things here. This seems extremely relevant. Client X and client Y, they seem to be coordinates, probably of where I clicked. What else? Wasn't holding the control key down. Something about layer X, layer Y, I don't even know what that is. Movement X, movement Y, offset X and offset Y. That's kind of interesting. That's giving us very slightly different numbers. I feel like this is the offset of the paragraph from its parent. That is my memory of what that is. So that's taking into account a small amount of margin. And then what else have we got here? Page X, page Y, all kinds of stuff, right? Screen X, screen Y, all kinds of information about this click that I just did. Type is click. That seems very sensible. Target, oh, that's interesting. So it's got a target, right? So the target is the paragraph. So the event has information about what got clicked when I clicked on it. So there's a lot of information here, but one thing about this, right, is like I'm just kind of trying to read the tea leaves of this console output. There's not any very helpful information about what these things are beyond their property names. So while that is one way to get a sense of what's going on, click, it would be better to kind of read the documentation. So for instance, we could go and we could say Mozilla, good grief, click event. And we would find the documentation of the click event. Click event, okay. So what do we learn about this? So now we're talking about reading documentation, right? So there's a bunch of stuff here. I just want to take a quick look at a few things that are available here. A lot of this kind of stuff, again, we're gonna learn through examples, and then you can kind of read the documentation at your own leisure. So let's just kind of scroll down a bit. There's something kind of interesting here that you might read, which is that detail property that I kind of scrolled past is going to contain the number of times the user has clicked in a row. So if you double click, then it'll contain the number 2 to say that they clicked twice. If they triple click, then they clicked 3 times. You could imagine using that for something interesting, potentially. There's some specific stuff about Internet Explorer. Basically, Internet Explorer is a nightmare, and everyone is glad that it doesn't exist anymore. There's all kinds of problems. There's another bug here in early versions of Safari Mobile that's worth knowing about. And then we have some actual examples, right? So here's adding an event listener for a click on a button. This is a very classic thing that you might want to do. And the example actually works here, etc. And then if we keep scrolling down, we get browser compatibility, and then we're done. So not actually as much as you might imagine. So that's kind of my point, actually. So there's not as much information here as you would hope about the properties that are available inside the event that we get passed in that event variable. And the reason for that is that they actually are inside this thing called the interface here. So that's tricky because it doesn't really give you a lot of information about that being the case. But when you're looking at the documentation of some kind of event, like a click, for example, the interface is the thing that will tell you what kind of information you get. So if we click on there, we will see that it's a mouse event, right? So it's a specific kind of event that is occurring, and therefore we get specific kinds of information back. And here we usefully do get a list of all of the properties that are available when we get that click event. When we get that information in here, this event parameter, what can we find out, right? So for example, Alt key, which we saw, it's going to be true if when they clicked, they were holding down Alt. So you could imagine some really arcane combinations that you might use there. The button number that was pressed, so on a multi-button mouse, if you've got a left and a right click, for example, you would get a different number based on which button got clicked. That's interesting. Multiple buttons could be clicked at the same time. That's pretty interesting as well. Then X coordinate and Y coordinate, we kind of figured that out, and on, right? And so here, the good thing is that we've actually got some actual information about what's available here. And note that there's a couple of methods here too, but I wouldn't worry too much about those. And then we've got examples where we might do something with this mouse event. So the documentation, really when we're talking about events, I think the key is to read about what properties are available to you. And there's one more thing that I want to say about that. Which is that there's more to it than that. But let's actually use one of these. So this client X, client Y thing. Maybe let's take a look at that. What could we do with that? Well, I mean, we're not building a super complicated program, so let's not try and get too creative. But what if we were to set the text inside the paragraph to the coordinates of the click, right? So we could say paragraph.innerText, which is how we would set the text of the paragraph itself. And we could assign it a template string that contains event.clientX, which is the X coordinate, and then also event.clientY, which is the Y coordinate. And then when we go and click on this paragraph, back over here, if I click here, for example, you can see that the text of my paragraph has been changed to 396.135, and if I click over here, now it's 13.136. And you can see that if I click within the paragraph, which is always the thing that's trying to detect these clicks, I'm getting the XY coordinates on the page of where that click occurred. Now clearly that's going to be more, there are more useful things to do than to just print them out, although even that could be potentially pretty fun. But the key thing is that that information is available to us because it is a mouse event, right? And that we can read the documentation and know specifically what client X and client Y are. So these are that's a mouse event specific kind of thing that we might be interested in. But the other thing that's worth knowing when we're reading this documentation is that it goes deeper than that. And again, it's a little bit hidden, but here you can see that mouse event derives from UI event. So UI event is another category of event that mouse event derives from. When they say derives from, they mean it extends it or it inherits from it. So we're talking about object-oriented programming and inheritance here, right? So a mouse event is a kind of UI event, and in fact a UI event is a kind of event, just a regular event. So there's also this inheritance chain going on, and each one of these steps in the chain, so we've got mouse event, then UI event, and event, all of the information from each one of those, as you know from inheritance, is available in the event information that we get. So just by way of example of that, let's go and look at the main event class. Because that's going to be present for every single event we ever work with. So what are we going to see in here? Well, again, there's a lot of documentation. But let's just go and look at the default properties, right? And some of these we saw, right? Like bubbles we saw. Whether or not the event bubbles up through the DOM. Not something I want to talk about right now, although I'm happy to have a conversation about it with you. Again, there's a bunch of pieces of information, like current target is a read-only thing, compose. A lot of these are really, really specific. Really the one that I want to draw your attention to is this one here, target. The target property is a really important part of, although I like timestamp as well, I hadn't noticed that. Timestamp seems exciting. Anyway, target is one of the most important properties of your events that you're going to end up wanting to work with, because the beautiful thing about target is it tells you what element the event occurred to, like who got clicked, it's in target. Now, in our current program, obviously, it's kind of obvious who got clicked because we know that it was the paragraph that we added the event listener to. But once you're doing more complicated programming, and maybe you're adding event listeners to multiple, like clicked listeners to multiple elements on your page, it's going to be important to just be able to find out which thing got clicked by accessing the target. So the thing that this allows us to do is, instead of saying paragraph.innerText, I could say event.target.innerText. And event.target is going to contain whatever element got clicked. Now, in this instance, that's going to be the same result, right? If I head back here and I click, the same result occurs, because the event.target is just the paragraph, right? But the nice thing about this is that it's a little bit more generic. And in fact, we can use this to write better programs. So let's write a better program. So let me say, let's work with, what are we going to work with here? Let's work with the main heading, which I believe is called main-heading. Is that correct? Main heading. So we've got main heading and subheading. So let's do something to both of these. Let's make them both react to clicks. So we've got main heading, and let's do the same thing for subheading. Don't spell it like that, sub-heading, yeah. So now we've got two different elements. One thing I might want to do is I might want to react to a click on them, but I might want to do the same thing in both cases, right? So maybe I want to make them turn red. So I might have a function called setRedTextColor. And again, and I'm going to use this as my event handler, right? So I'm going to say main heading dot add event listener. So I want to listen for what? A click on my main heading. And when it gets clicked on, I want to call setRedTextColor. So this, I'm not using an anonymous function here, right? I'm saying call this named function down here. And then I want to do the same thing for my subheading. Subheading.addEventListener, click setRedTextColor. So now both of these two headings are calling the same function when they get clicked. Now what's the significance of that? It means that when I'm in here in this function, when I am in here writing my code, I don't actually know which thing got clicked inherently, right? I don't know. Could have been main heading, could have been subheading, so I can't just change the color of the specific one that got clicked by just knowing which one it was. Instead, I need to use event.target. This is what it's for, right? Event.target tells me which thing was clicked. That's literally what its job is. So if I use the thing inside event.target, I know that I'm talking to the thing that got clicked, the thing that is reacting to this click event. And then I can do something to it, right? I can set its style, I could set its color property to red. Let's stick with something nice and clear. So the beauty here, right, is that I can apply I can use the same function to respond to a click event for 2 different things, or 1,000 different things, quite frankly, because event.target tells me which thing was clicked. I don't have to have a separate function for main heading and a separate function for subheading. I can use the same function, and I can use event.target to distinguish which thing was clicked. So then we have lorem ipsum I can click, and it turns red, and $sit_amit, which is the H2, I can click, and it turns red. So they're like little buttons, but the beauty, and we should find this beautiful in programming, the beauty here is that they're using the same function to turn red. And indeed, we could do the same thing for the paragraph as well now. We could add paragraph here, and paragraph here, and instead of having to write, another function to handle the paragraph going red, we can just do the same thing. It can also call set red text color, and then when I click on the paragraph, it can turn red. So all 3 of these things are using the same function because we can use event.target. I'm belaboring it, but this is a beautiful programming moment, right? This is how we write good programs. So that's quite a deep dive into just one particular usage of add event listener, right? Which is to listen for a click and to call a function in response to that click. And we've seen important things like the fact that if we add the event listener to different elements on the page, we can listen for that event specifically and only on that element, or we can react differently depending on which element was clicked. And we've also seen that if we use the event parameter that comes into our event handler, the function that is called by add event listener, we can do things like target the specific thing that was clicked, or if it's a mouse event, we can get things like where on the page the click took place, and so forth. Now, the basic principle here is the same for all events. They all work the same way. You add them to the specific element that you want to listen to. You give the name of the event that you're interested in hearing about, and you give it a function that is going to react when that event is triggered. It's always the same. That is the beauty of learning something like this event-driven programming, right? It's a formula that we can use, and the key thing is to know, well, what kinds of events are there? So let's take a look at the question of what kinds of events there are. Let's go back to just having our paragraph. So how would we know what events there are? Again, probably it's likely that we are going to see them in examples. Unsurprising, right? However, there is documentation. If we go, for example, to the Mozilla event reference, which you can search for Mozilla event reference if you want to, you can see a list of all of the kinds of events there are, including their names here, right? So these are all of the different names of events that we could be listening for in our add event listener. Some of them are going to be totally uninteresting, you are not going to care about an abort event, for example, probably. And maybe you will, who knows? Or an error. That's exciting. I love these ones, the online event and the offline event. They get triggered when the user's computer goes online or offline. That's pretty interesting. I think that there's some real potential there. Maybe we can do something with that later on. Focus events, WebSocket events, session history events, CSS animation events, CSS transition events, form events, print events, text composition events, view events. Oh, so that's an interesting one, right? Scroll, I'm just thinking about the classics. So the scroll event happens every time the user scrolls in their browser. So they move the view up and down using the scroll bar. You're probably already familiar with this idea of a resize event. So if I change the size of my window like that, that's a resize event. You can be notified of when those happen. Clipboard events, cut, copy, and paste, keyboard events, mouse events, there are a lot of events, my friends. Okay, so reading that list and just kind of poking around in the documentation is a great way to learn about what is possible. However, you are also just going to learn by seeing stuff, right? The basic principle is always the same. You have the name of the event and you have the function that gets called when that event happens. So what else is there? Well, we've seen click. Let's look at some more mouse events to start with, just so that you've got a few kind of loaded into memory. So let's add an event listener to our paragraph. And let's add the mouse enter event. So the mouse enter event is an event that will be called when the mouse moves into the space of the element. So I'm going to write this as an anonymous function again, just because I think that that's easier in this instance. So what do I want to do when the mouse goes over the top of my paragraph? Let's continue to keep it simple. And now I'm going to be using event.target all the time because it's just a better way of doing things. And I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm just going to set the text color to red just because it's nice and easy for us to see. So before we were using click, now we're using mouse enter. The distinction is that this is now going to happen just because I move my mouse across the text, right? So it's responding to the movement of my mouse instead of the click of the mouse button. There's a corresponding one called mouse leave, M-O-U-S-E, leave, and that one gets called when the mouse leaves. So for it to leave, it has to enter, obviously. So now my mouse is over, and when I take my mouse away, then the effect occurs, right? So it's like an element that kind of cares about the way that the mouse is moving through the space of the screen, which is pretty interesting. Like, that is already interesting. You could think of something obvious like, change the color backwards and forwards when you have a mouse enter and a mouse leave. That's basically just a rollover, right? But you could maybe think of something more exciting than that. So what if, for instance, let's have both. Let's have a mouse enter and a mouse leave. I'm just going to remove these bits here. So mouse enter and a mouse leave. What if we wanted to display a secret message when the user mouses over the paragraph? So to display the secret message, we could do that on mouse enter, right? So the mouse goes over the paragraph and we show them the secret message. So to do that, we could use the inner text of the paragraph, right? We could say secret message. I don't know what it is. Toast is great. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about apparently. So that's one half of it. So on mouse enter, the secret message appears, but it doesn't go away. So how am I going to make it go away? Well, I need to reset the inner text to what it was before, but I can't remember what it was before. So what am I supposed to do? Well, I need to remember what it was. So I could have original text as a variable up here, and I could get hold of the inner text of the paragraph as it is at the start of the program, right? And then I could replace the original text whenever the mouse leaves it. So let's put the original text back into the paragraph after the mouse leaves, and then we have our secret message. So mousing over, secret message toast is great, and then I leave, and then it goes back to what it was. Very satisfying. Now note that this isn't something that you can, it's not something you can easily do in CSS, right? Because CSS is not designed for changing the text content or the content of your page. It's all about the visuals. So this is a case where doing this in JavaScript makes a lot of sense. This is where being able to use these event listeners is giving us some actual power here. One other nice, I think, extra mouse event is the context menu event, which is when you right-click on something. This is maybe even a better way of finding secret messages, right? Is that you have to do a context click on them. So if I mouse over and then I do a right-click, then I get my secret message, and then it reverts again, right? So secret message is there, and then once I leave, it's gone again. So that's kind of nice as well. So I like that idea that we can respond to that context menu. There are a lot more mouse events, but that basic of like a click, mouse enter, mouse leave, and maybe context menu, that gives us a lot to play with, right? And as you've been able to see, and I'm really just playing with them by changing the event name here, and then doing something with it. Oh, and I should really be using event.target here, right? Not paragraph. I feel naughty. There you go. So that is giving us some nice power. The other thing that we're most likely to want to be able to play around with in terms of user input, the basics, is the keyboard, right? So there are keyboard events as well. Keyboard events are a little bit different, right? Because you don't really want to listen for a keyboard event on the paragraph because the paragraph isn't something you can type into. So really, when we're thinking about keyboard events, we should really either be listening to them on the entire document, which is what I'm going to do right now. So add event listener on the document. Or you might want to add them if you're using text input elements where the user can actually type something in. So the main keyboard event that's most obviously useful is key down. Again, same thing. It just calls a function which has an event parameter, and we can do something, therefore, when a key gets pressed down, any key. So for example, why don't we, well, let's just, since we've got the paragraph sitting there, let's say paragraph dot style, let's just set its color. I don't want to overthink this. So we'll set the color of the paragraph to red anytime a key gets pressed. I guess we don't need this original text now. So we've got a paragraph. When a key gets pressed down anywhere in the document, right? So it's important that we're listening to the document here, not to a specific element. So if I press a key now, 1, 2, 3, press, then we get the color change. So you could imagine your whole page can kind of respond to any key presses that the user does, and therefore maybe you can have like a secret key code that you could type in order to interact with the page. However, especially if you want to have a secret key code, you kind of need to know which key got pressed, right? And so where would you find the information about which key got pressed? Hopefully you are thinking it will be somewhere inside this event parameter, right? Because that contains the information about the event. And you would be correct. So that's nice. So the event contains information about which key it is, and you'll be familiar with this as well. One of the things that it contains is a key code property, and that will give us the ASCII key code of the key that got pressed. So for example, I could only change the color of this paragraph if the event.keycode is equal to 32, which is the spacebar. So I could wrap that color change in there. So I'm saying call this function when any key gets pressed down, and if the key code that was pressed down is equal to 32, the spacebar, only then should you change this color of the paragraph to red. So if we go and look back at this now, I can, maybe you can hear that, I can press any keys I want, as long as I don't press the spacebar, nothing happens, and as soon as I press the spacebar, it turns red because it checked and that was the key that got pressed, right? The other one that we have access to here that's probably the most useful is event.key without the code, and that lets us actually get the actual string version of the key. So for example, if I want to check if the user pressed the whatever R key, I can also use key to check just against a string. So if the key was the R key, note that that has to be a lowercase r, then I will change the color. Same idea. So if I press various keys, nothing happens. If I press the R key, then it turns red, right? So I can respond to specific keys, and there you could imagine that now I can actually type stuff into the paragraph if I want to, because I could say, for example, this will be very imperfect, but I could say that paragraph.innerText, I want to add paragraph.innerText plus event.key. So I want, every time a key gets pressed, I want to change the inner text of the paragraph so that I add the key that was pressed to the end of it. So if I'm looking here and I start typing things, you can see that I'm just typing onto the web page now. Kind of cool. You can see some disadvantages here, like the fact that it keeps saying enter. And that's because that's the way the key property works. It contains the name of the key that was pressed. So if I wanted to make this more sophisticated, I have a few extra steps to go in terms of dealing with keys that are not just letter keys. But we've made it a long way towards being able to just detect whatever it is that the user types. So that is very exciting. I'm sure you will agree. A little tedious perhaps, but we can also detect key up. That would be detected when, let me just change this back to a styling thing. So paragraph.style, color is assigned red. The only difference between key up and key down is that it is triggered when the key comes up. So I press a key down, nothing happens, I release it, it turns red. Hey presto. We could use this to kind of toggle the color of our paragraph. Say if I have two of these, one of them is for key up and one of them is for key down, maybe I make the color red when I press the key down, and I make it black when I release the key. So then I have the case that I can kind of toggle the color of this text on and off. So we're just dealing with different kinds of visuals, visual effects, or other effects, like we could add specific things onto our page by using create element and append child. There's no real limit to what we can do, but the beauty is that now we can do those things in response to specific events. I will end this by adding an event listener to the offline, because I just love that. And what should we do if the user's computer goes offline? Let's get the heading, and let's say that if we go offline, then we should say main heading.inner text is a sad face. So if the user's browser goes offline, replace the main heading with a sad face. So currently I'm online. You can see that my Wi-Fi is working nicely. But if I were to go offline, and if I haven't been stupid in thinking that I would do this live, if I turn this off, then nothing happened. That's really depressing. I'm sorry. Yeah, that didn't work. So I will have to think about whether that was a really dumb thing, and maybe I will provide an example separately from me just flailing around. I have humiliated myself. I wonder. Let's go and look this up. Let's let this be a lesson to us all. So let me find that offline event. Where's the offline event? There it is. Let's see. Oh, okay. So there you go. So I see this and I notice that it says that it's for the window, and I used it on the document. And you can see here it says window.addEventListener offline. So the mistake that I made is the thing I was trying to listen for offlineness to was the wrong thing. So what I want to do, so there's another special variable called window that refers to the browser, basically, the browser window itself. And that is the thing I need to listen to. So window.addEventListener offline. Let's try this again. Let's go back here. So lorem ipsum, and then I go offline. Please work. Hey! So now my browser is feeling really sad because I went offline. That's amazing to me. Like, that's so cool that you can respond to something so kind of personal and like irritating for the user, quite frankly, but that's a really cool possibility. And there are many, many more. You saw me scrolling through the list of events, but this online-offline thing is really interesting. Scrolling is interesting. Resize is interesting. Cut, copy, and paste is interesting. There's a lot that we can be interested in when we are thinking about these things. So that is my introduction to DOM events. From here, from here the key thing is really to look at possibilities and to relish the fact that now you are able to write plain JavaScript programs that interact with web pages and that respond to the user and to other kinds of events. So go forth and do event-driven programming. I wish you well.